Imagine waking up one morning, walking to your mailbox, and finding a letter that says your house, the house you paid for, the house you've lived in for years, no longer belongs to you. It's been foreclosed by an HOA you were never a member of. This is the story of what happens when an HOA forecloses on the wrong house. Our story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood in state. The kind of place where kids ride bikes on the sidewalk, neighbors wave to each other, and the biggest drama is whose dog got into whose trash can. Our homeowner, let's call him Mike, bought his house in year. It was a modest 3-bedroom. Nothing fancy. But it was his. He'd saved for years. Made every mortgage payment on time. Never had a single problem with anyone. Now, there was an HOA in the neighborhood next to his. But Mike's house? His house was specifically excluded from that HOA. It was written into the deed. In black and white. The HOA had zero jurisdiction over his property. Mike knew this. The HOA knew this. Or at least, they should have known this. Now, let me introduce you to the HOA board. Every good story needs a villain, and this one has a whole committee of them. The board was led by a woman, let's call her Karen. Because of course her name was Karen. Karen had been on the board for years. She treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Every fence needed her approval. Every paint color had to match her taste. If your grass was 1 inch too tall, you'd get a warning letter within hours. But here's the thing about power, the more you have, the more you want. And Karen wanted more. She'd been eyeing Mike's property for years. It was on the edge of the HOA's territory. Prime real estate. And Karen didn't like that someone outside her control lived that close to her kingdom. It started with a letter. Mike came home from work one day and found an official-looking envelope in his mailbox. He opened it, and his face dropped. Notice of violation, it read. Your property is in violation of HOA Covenant 14.3, unauthorized fence height. Mike stared at the letter. Then he looked at his fence. The same fence that had been there since he bought the house. The same fence the previous owner had built. The same fence that was perfectly within city code. And most importantly, the HOA had no authority over his property. Mike did what any reasonable person would do. He wrote back. Politely. I'm not a member of your HOA. Please check your records. He assumed that would be the end of it. He was wrong. This was just the beginning. The next week, another letter arrived. This time it was a fine. $100 for unauthorized exterior modifications. Mike called the HOA management company directly. There's been a mistake, he explained. My property isn't part of your HOA. It's excluded in the deed. The person on the phone was sympathetic. I understand, sir. Let me look into this and get back to you. Mike waited. And waited. Instead of a callback, he got another letter. This time the fine had doubled. $200. Then $500. Then $1,000. Each letter became more aggressive. More threatening. Failure to pay will result in further action, they warned. This is your final notice, followed by 3 more final notices. Mike kept all the letters. He kept every email. He recorded every phone call, perfectly legal in his state, which is a one-party consent state. He didn't know it yet, but those records would become the most important documents in his life. What Mike didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until much later, was that Karen and the HOA board had a plan. See, the HOA had been trying to expand its territory. They wanted to absorb Mike's street into the HOA. More houses meant more dues. More dues meant more power. And more power meant, well, you get the idea. Mike's house was the key. If they could force him to submit, to pay the fines, to acknowledge their authority, it would set a precedent. Every other house on the street would fall like dominoes. But Mike wasn't a domino. Mike was a brick wall. And Karen was about to run straight into him at full speed. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, why didn't Mike just hire a lawyer? He did. He'd consulted with an attorney early on. The attorney sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA, explaining, with citations, with legal references, with the actual property records, that Mike's house was not, and had never been, part of the HOA. The HOA's response? They ignored it. Not just ignored it, they escalated. You see, most people, when faced with a threat they can't win, back down. Karen had been running the HOA for years, and she'd learned one thing: most people don't fight. They pay the fine. They cut the grass. They repaint the mailbox. Because fighting costs money, and fighting costs time, and fighting is stressful. Karen assumed Mike would be like everyone else. This was her biggest mistake. One Tuesday morning, Mike was at work when his phone rang. It was his neighbor. Mike, there's someone at your house. They're putting a sign in your yard. Mike's blood ran cold. What kind of sign? A foreclosure notice. Mike left work immediately. He drove home. And there it was, a bright yellow sign staked into his front lawn. Foreclosure, this property is subject to sale. The HOA had filed a lien against his property for unpaid fines. Fines that now totaled over $8,000 with penalties and interest and administrative fees. And when he hadn't paid, because why would he pay something he didn't owe? They'd moved to foreclose. They were going to take his house. For fines he never owed. From an HOA he was never part of. Mike stood on his front lawn, staring at that yellow sign, and something inside him snapped. Not in anger. Not in desperation. In determination. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. I want to sue them, he said. I want to sue them for everything they've got. Now, let's talk about Mike's attorney for a moment. Because while this story has one hero and many villains, every hero needs a guide. Mike's attorney, let's call him David, specialized in property law. Specifically, he specialized in cases where HOAs overstepped their authority. He'd seen this before. Power-hungry boards. Unlawful fines. Intimidation tactics. But even David had never seen an HOA foreclose on a house they had absolutely no jurisdiction over. This is the clearest case I've ever seen, David told Mike. They don't just have a weak case. They have a no case. And the fact that you have records of every interaction, the letters, the emails, the phone calls, this is a prosecutor's dream. David didn't just file a lawsuit. He filed a lawsuit that read like a documentary. Every letter the HOA sent was an exhibit. Every phone call was transcribed. Every time Karen or the board was warned that Mike's property wasn't part of the HOA, and ignored that warning, was highlighted in bold. The lawsuit alleged wrongful foreclosure, trespass, intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, violation of state consumer protection laws. And here's the kicker, David demanded punitive damages. Not just compensation for what Mike lost. Punishment. The kind of punishment that would make sure no HOA in America ever did this again. When the HOA board received the lawsuit, there was, and I'm quoting from court documents here, significant concern among board members. That's legal speak for absolute panic. See, the HOA had insurance. But insurance companies have a funny habit of not covering you when you do something criminal. And foreclosing on a house you don't have jurisdiction over. That's not just a mistake. That's fraud. The insurance company sent a letter to the HOA. We are reviewing your coverage, they wrote. In the meantime, you are responsible for your own legal costs. Legal costs that were about to become very, very expensive. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, David's team uncovered something that made the case even stronger. Internal emails between HOA board members. Emails where Karen had been explicitly told, by the HOA's own attorney, that Mike's property wasn't part of the association. Emails where she'd responded, "I don't care. He needs to pay like everyone else." These weren't just mistakes. This was knowing, deliberate, documented misconduct. David had struck gold. About 2 months into the lawsuit, the HOA's attorney reached out to David. "My clients would like to discuss a settlement." David listened. The HOA was offering to drop the foreclosure, waive all fines, and pay Mike's legal fees. David took this offer to Mike. "It's a reasonable settlement," David said. "They're admitting they were wrong. You'll walk away with your house, your reputation, and no legal bills." Mike thought about it. He thought about the months of stress. The sleepless nights. The fear of losing his home. The yellow sign in his yard for all his neighbors to see. Then he thought about Karen. About the HOA board. About all the other homeowners who might face the same thing if the HOA wasn't stopped. "No," Mike said. "We're not settling. We're going to trial." The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and, if the courtroom sketch artist's drawings are anything to go by, increasingly panicked expressions on the faces of the HOA board members. David's opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began. "This case is about a group of people who believed they were above the law. Who believed that their power, a power they gave themselves, was absolute. Who, when told repeatedly that they were wrong, chose to double down instead of correct their mistake. And who nearly cost an innocent man his home because of their arrogance." When the HOA's attorney stood up for their opening statement, it was less compelling. "This is a simple misunderstanding," she said. "A clerical error that was blown out of proportion." The jury was not impressed. The star witness, surprisingly, wasn't Mike. It was the HOA's own former management company employee, a woman who had taken Mike's first phone call months earlier. "I told my supervisor that Mr. Mike's property wasn't in the HOA," she testified. "I flagged it in the system. I sent an email. And then, nothing happened." "What do you mean, nothing happened?" David asked. "The fines kept going out," she said. "I raised it again at a team meeting. I was told, and I remember this clearly, the board wants to proceed. Don't worry about it." The jury leaned forward in their seats. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict: Mike won. On every count. The damages awarded were staggering. Actual damages, $85,000. Emotional distress, $200,000. Punitive damages, $750,000. Total, over $1 million. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was what happened next. The day after the verdict, Karen resigned from the HOA board. Within a week, 3 other board members had resigned as well. The HOA's insurance premiums skyrocketed, when they could find anyone willing to insure them at all. Every homeowner in the neighborhood received a letter explaining what had happened and how much the legal fight had cost them in HOA dues. They were not happy. A special election was held. A new board was formed. And the first thing that new board did was pass a resolution: the HOA shall not pursue enforcement actions against any property without first confirming, through independent legal review, that the property falls within the association's jurisdiction. In other words, check before you attack. As for Mike, he still lives in that same modest 3-bedroom house. The foreclosure sign is long gone. The HOA hasn't bothered him since. He paid off his mortgage with part of the settlement. He invested the rest. And every summer, he hosts a block party for his neighbors. The block party tradition started the year after the trial. Mike grills burgers. The kids run through the sprinklers. And someone always raises a glass and says, "To Mike, the man who beat the HOA. Karen no longer lives in the neighborhood. She moved away shortly after her resignation. No one knows where she went. No one particularly cares. Now, what should you take away from this story? First, document everything. Everything. Every letter, every email, every phone call. Mike won because he had records. Without those records, his story would have been dismissed as, he said, she said. Second, when you're right, don't back down. The HOA relied on Mike giving up. They'd used the same playbook on dozens of other homeowners. It almost always worked. But Mike didn't give up, and the entire machine collapsed. Third, HOAs have power, but they don't have unlimited power. They have rules they have to follow. Laws they have to obey. And when they don't, when they overreach, they can lose everything. The HOA tried to take Mike's house. Instead, they lost $1 million, their reputation, and their entire board. And as Mike still says to this day, best trade I never made. That was the story of how one man took on an HOA, and won. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more HOA stories every week. And if you have an HOA story, whether it's a victory, a nightmare, or something in between, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Have you ever dealt with an HOA from hell? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.